I spent 52 years building something I thought mattered. Brennan's Pharmacy, corner of Monroe and Sprague in Spokane, Washington. Every morning at 6 a.m., I'd unlock those doors. Every night at 8 p.m., I'd count the register, restock the shelves, sweep the floors. My wife Margaret worked the counter on weekends, her feet swelling in her sensible shoes, smiling at every customer like they were family. We raised 3 kids in the Victorian house we bought in 1968, back when Brown's Addition was affordable, before the tech money rolled in and changed everything. Robert, Jennifer, Michael, I put them all through college. Worked 70-hour weeks so they could have what Margaret and I never did. She wore the same winter coat for 15 years so Jennifer could take dance lessons. We took out a second mortgage so Robert could go to Seattle University. Drove a car held together with duct tape and prayers so Michael could play hockey. We gave them everything. Everything. Margaret died 6 years ago. Breast cancer. The kids came to the funeral, stayed 3 days, sorted through their mother's jewelry, and left. I understood. They had lives, careers, families of their own. Distance didn't mean absence of love. That's what I told myself. On my 80th birthday, I woke up early and made pancakes from scratch. Margaret's recipe, the one she taught me our first year of marriage. I set the dining room table with the good china, the set her mother gave us as a wedding present. 4 plates, 4 sets of silverware. The cloth napkins we only used at Christmas. I'd called each of them 2 weeks prior. Robert answered distracted, traffic noise in the background. I'll see what I can do, Dad. Jennifer was warmer but vague. Can we do something the week after? Michael texted back. Sounds good, old man. We'll try to make it work. I chose to believe them. I bought a chocolate cake from Rocket Bakery, Margaret's favorite. I even put on the wool sweater Jennifer had sent 3 Christmases ago, still with the tags on. By noon, the pancakes were cold. By 3, I was calling. Voicemails. By 6, the candles had started to sag in their wax. At 7:19 p.m., my phone buzzed. A group text from Robert. Dad, we talked. We can't keep doing this. You need more care than we can provide. We've arranged a spot at Maplewood Elder Care. They're expecting you Monday. We'll handle the house sale. I read it 3 times. Then I sat in Margaret's rocking chair and watched the candles melt into the frosting. Monday morning, a van arrived. 2 attendants helped me pack a suitcase, clothes, my rosary, a photo of Margaret at Lake Coeur d'Alene. They drove me to Maplewood, a low brick building that smelled like disinfectant and loneliness. Room 14B, beige walls, a window facing the parking lot. A roommate named Earl who snored like a chainsaw. I thought I'd die there within a month, but something unexpected happened. Earl turned out to be a Korean War veteran with a wicked sense of humor who taught me cribbage and told stories that made me laugh until I cried. Across the hall lived Dorothy, a retired school teacher who recited Whitman from memory and corrected everyone's grammar. 2 doors down was Rose, who'd worked 30 years at Kaiser Aluminum and made the best peanut brittle I'd ever tasted. We became family. Not the kind you're born into, the kind you choose. We played poker on Thursday nights, watched Jeopardy every evening at 7, shouting answers at the TV, shared contraband whiskey from Rose's Listerine bottle, celebrated small victories and mourned small losses. My children never visited. Robert called once about paperwork for selling the house, my house, Margaret's house, the house where we'd raised them. Jennifer sent a generic birthday card a year later, unsigned, clearly bought in bulk. Michael didn't call at all. I stopped waiting for them. In my 2nd year at Maplewood, I had a minor stroke. During recovery, lying in the infirmary with Earl reading the newspaper aloud beside my bed, I had a moment of absolute clarity. I called my lawyer, Thomas Whitmore, a man I'd known since he was a kid buying comic books at the pharmacy. He came on a gray afternoon in March, carrying his briefcase and a legal pad. Tom, I said, I want to change my will. Everything. The house, the investments, the pharmacy sale money, all of it. I want it divided equally among every resident currently living at Maplewood Elder Care. Tom's pen stopped moving. Walter, your children made their choice, I said. I'm making mine. It took 3 weeks to finalize. I signed it with Earl and Dorothy as witnesses. I felt lighter than I had in years. 7 months later, I died peacefully in my sleep. My children arranged the funeral, cheapest chapel, generic flowers, a eulogy that made me sound like a stranger. Robert wore an expensive suit. Jennifer cried with dry eyes. Michael checked his phone during the service. The chapel was mostly empty, until the back doors opened. 23 residents of Maplewood Elder Care filed in slowly, helping each other, dressed in their Sunday best. They filled 3 pews at the back. Earl wore his military medals. Dorothy brought tissues. Rose held a small photo of me from our last poker game. After the service, my lawyer stood at the front of the chapel. Before we conclude, I need to read Mr. Brennan's last will and testament. Robert leaned forward. Jennifer stopped pretending to cry. Michael looked up from his phone. Tom read the entire document aloud. Every clause, every name, every dollar amount divided 23 ways among the residents of Maplewood. The house, the investments, the savings, the car in storage, everything split equally among the people who'd become my family when my blood family walked away. To my children, I left one thing, a handwritten note. Tom handed it to Robert, who read it aloud, his voice hollow. Family is who stays. Family is who shows up. Family is who sits beside your bed and reads you the news when you can't hold the paper yourself. You taught me what family isn't. They taught me what family is. Learn the difference before it's too late. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Rose laughed through her tears. Walter, you magnificent bastard. My children stood frozen, faces cycling through shock, rage, disbelief. Robert crumpled the letter in his fist. This is bullshit. This is justice, Dorothy said, standing with all her teacher authority. You abandoned him. You don't get to stand there now and claim your victims. Earl stood too, leaning on his cane. I know he waited for you on his 80th birthday. Set the table for 4, made a cake, waited until 9 at night. I know he cried that night alone, wondering what he'd done wrong. I know because I was there. Where the hell were you? The residents of Maplewood filed out slowly, leaving my children standing alone in that chapel, statues of everything they'd lost and everything they'd never understood. After the funeral, they all went to the house on Brown's Addition. Earl made coffee in Margaret's old percolator. Rose served chocolate cake on Margaret's good plates. They sat in the living room where I'd waited on my 80th birthday, where I'd watched candles melt, where I'd learned the hardest lesson of my life. Dorothy raised her cup. To Walter, who taught us that it's never too late to choose your family. To Walter, they echoed. I'd spent 80 years learning what Margaret tried to tell me before she died. Don't wait for people who won't come. Find the ones who will. I learned it late, but I learned it true. And in the end, I left everything to the family that mattered. The family that stayed, the family that showed up, the family that proved blood means nothing when the people who share it refuse to care. My children wanted an inheritance. I gave them a lesson instead, and I gave my real family everything they deserved. I woke up on the morning of my 80th birthday to the sound of rain tapping against the window of my bedroom, the same bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 43 years. The sheets still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets, even though she'd been gone 6 years. I kept buying them at the farmer's market downtown, tucking them into the linen closet like she used to, like somehow that would keep her memory from fading. The house creaked as I sat up, my knees protesting like they did every morning now. The Victorian we'd bought in 1968 had good bones, as the realtor had said back then, but good bones still aged. The radiators clanged to life, hissing steam through pipes that probably hadn't been replaced since Eisenhower. Through the lace curtains Margaret had insisted on keeping, I could see Brown's Addition waking up, joggers and expensive athletic wear, a Tesla pulling out of the driveway across the street, where old Mr. Kowalski used to live before his daughter moved him to Arizona. Spokane had changed. Or maybe I'd just gotten too old to change with it. I shuffled downstairs, holding the banister tighter than I used to, and made my way into the kitchen. The black and white checkered floor was the same one Margaret had picked out at a salvage yard in 1972, each tile laid by hand one August weekend when the kids were at summer camp. Robert had been 12 then, already serious and studious. Jennifer was 9, all scraped knees and wild curls. Michael was 6, still young enough to believe his father could fix anything. I pulled out the cast iron skillet, Margaret's skillet, and started making pancakes. Not from a box, from scratch. The way she'd taught me during our first year of marriage when we were broke and happy and didn't know any better. Flour, eggs, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, a splash of vanilla. The kitchen filled with that warm, yeasty smell that always meant Sunday mornings and family and everything we'd built together. I made enough batter for 4 people. The dining room table was already set from the night before. I'd used the good china, the set Margaret's mother had given us as a wedding present, white with tiny blue flowers around the rim. I'd polished the silver. I'd even dug out the cloth napkins, the ones we only used at Christmas and Easter, because 80 felt like an occasion worth celebrating. 4 plates, 4 sets of silverware, 4 water glasses arranged just so. I'd called each of my children 2 weeks ago. Robert answered on the third ring, his voice distracted. I could hear traffic in the background, that distinctive Seattle rush hour chaos. Dad, hey, sorry, I'm just heading into a meeting. What's up? Just wanted to remind you about the 23rd, I'd said, keeping my voice light. My birthday. I was hoping you could come over. I'm making dinner. A pause. The sound of a car horn. Right. I'll see what I can do. Lisa's got the kids in like 15 activities right now. You know how it is. I didn't, actually. When Robert was growing up, activities meant Little League on Saturdays and church on Sundays. But I said, of course, just let me know. Will do, Dad. Gotta run. Jennifer had been warmer, but no more committal. She answered on the first ring, breathless like she'd been running. Dad, hi, how are you? Good, sweetheart, calling about my birthday. Thought maybe you could drive up from Portland for the day. Oh, Dad. That tone. The one that meant bad news wrapped in sympathy. I would love to, but Marcus has a conference that weekend, and I'm solo with the girls. Can we do something the week after? I promise I'll make it up to you. Sure, I'd said, even though we both knew the week after would turn into the month, after would turn into never. No problem. Michael hadn't answered at all. I'd left a voicemail. He texted back 3 days later. Sounds good, old man. We'll try to make it work. Try. That word was doing a lot of heavy lifting, but I'd chosen to believe them. I'd spent 52 years running Brennan's Pharmacy on the corner of Monroe and Sprague, and you don't stay in business that long without learning optimism. Or maybe it was stubbornness. Margaret used to say I couldn't tell the difference. By noon, the pancakes were cold. I'd wrap them in foil and put them in the fridge, telling myself people ran late, traffic happened, plans changed. I sat in the living room, Margaret's living room really, she'd decorated every inch of it, and watched the rain streak down the bay windows. The grandfather clock in the corner, the one we'd bought at an estate sale in Coeur d'Alene, ticked away each minute with the kind of authority that made silence feel even heavier. I'd picked up the chocolate cake from Rocket Bakery the day before. Margaret had loved their cakes, dense and rich with frosting that wasn't too sweet. I'd ordered the same one we'd had at our 50th anniversary party, chocolate with raspberry filling and Happy Birthday, Walter, written in blue icing. It sat on the kitchen counter now, ridiculous and hopeful, like a monument to my own delusion. At 3 o'clock, I called Robert. Voicemail, I called Jennifer. Voicemail, I called Michael. Voicemail. The rain picked up, hammering against the roof, and I sat there in the rocking chair that used to be Margaret's favorite spot, the one where she'd nurse the babies and read them stories and rock them to sleep while I closed up the pharmacy. I could still see her there sometimes if I closed my eyes, her dark hair going gray at the temples, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her voice soft and steady as she recited Goodnight Moon for the 1,000th time. They're coming, I said out loud to the empty room, to her ghost, to myself. They're just running late. The grandfather clock struck 6, then 7. At 7:19 p.m., my phone buzzed on the side table. I grabbed it so fast I nearly knocked over the lamp. One of those Tiffany-style ones Margaret had found at an antique shop in Cheney, all stained glass and delicate brass. A group text, from Robert, to me, Jennifer, and Michael. I had to read it 3 times before the words stopped swimming. Dad, we talked. We can't keep doing this. You need more care than we can provide. We've arranged a spot at Maplewood Elder Care. They're expecting you Monday. We'll handle the house sale. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Then I stared at the black mirror of it, at my own reflection. An old man in a wool sweater, sitting alone in a house that suddenly felt too big and too empty and too full of memories that nobody else wanted to keep. I didn't cry. I'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't fix anything. Margaret cried at the diagnosis and it didn't shrink the tumor. She cried during chemo and her hair fell out anyway. She cried the night before she died, holding my hand in the hospice bed they'd set up in our bedroom, and the sun still rose the next morning without her. Instead, I stood up, slowly, and walked into the kitchen. The cake sat there, 80 candles waiting to be lit, the icing starting to sweat in the warm room. I thought about lighting them anyway, singing to myself like some pathetic character in a movie nobody would want to watch. But what was the point? I left the cake on the counter and went upstairs to bed. The house settled around me, creaking and sighing like it was disappointed too. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain, and thought about Margaret. About how she'd always said family was the most important thing, how she'd built her whole life around these 3 kids we'd raised, how she'd sacrificed and saved and worried and loved with everything she had. and I wondered what she'd think of them now. What she'd think of me, lying here alone on my 80th birthday, reading a text message that said I wasn't worth their time. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, watching the ceiling, watching the shadows move across the plaster roses Margaret had insisted on keeping when we renovated in the 80s. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs, probably the wind knocking over the trash cans in the alley, and I didn't even get up to check. What did it matter anymore? Monday morning came too fast and too slow at the same time. I packed a suitcase, underwear, socks, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, my Sunday shoes, even though I didn't know if Maplewood had a chapel. I packed the rosary Margaret's mother had given me when we got married, black wood beads worn smooth from decades of Hail Marys. I packed the photo from our trip to Lake Coeur d'Alene in 1985, the one where Margaret was laughing so hard she'd bent double, her hand on my shoulder, the sun setting behind the mountains. I didn't pack the family photos from the living room mantel. If they didn't want to be family, they didn't get to be memories. The van arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. 2 attendants, both young enough to be my grandchildren, smiled with professional sympathy and helped me down the front steps. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still that flat gray color November does so well in eastern Washington. I took one last look at the house, at the porch where we'd carved pumpkins every Halloween, at the window where we'd put the Christmas tree every year, at the door we'd painted robin's egg blue because Margaret saw it in a magazine and fell in love. Then I got in the van and we drove away. Maplewood Elder Care was a 20-minute drive north, past the community college and the new Amazon warehouse and the old drive-in theater that had been turned into a storage facility. The building was low and brick, surrounded by Douglas firs that looked like they'd been there longer than the parking lot. A sign out front, forest green with gold lettering, welcomed residents and visitors. It looked like the kind of place you sent people you wanted to forget about comfortably. Inside smelled like every nursing home I'd ever visited, disinfectant trying to cover up the smell of age and sickness and dignity slowly slipping away. The lobby had beige walls, motivational posters about living your best life, and a fake fireplace that cycled through electric flames. A receptionist who couldn't have been more than 25 looked up from her computer and smiled that professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Brennan, we've been expecting you. Let me get Patricia." Patricia turned out to be the head nurse, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the kind of brisk efficiency that came from seeing too much sadness to let it slow her down. She showed me to room 14B, down a long hallway that smelled like cafeteria food and floor wax. The walls were decorated with artwork that looked like it came from a hotel liquidation sale. Generic landscapes, muted colors, nothing that would offend or inspire anyone. Room 14B was exactly what I'd expected. Beige walls, beige linoleum, beige curtains, a twin bed with a thin mattress and sheets that felt like they'd been washed 1,000 times, a narrow closet, a bedside table with a lamp, a window that looked out over the parking lot, where I could see the van that had brought me already pulling away, and a roommate. He was sitting on the other bed reading a Louis L'Amour Western and looked up when I walked in. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with white hair cut military short and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me in about 3 seconds. "You must be Brennan," he said, not getting up. "I'm Earl Patterson, Korean War, 1st Marine Division. Don't snore too loud and we'll get along fine." I set my suitcase on the bed and looked around the room that was going to be my entire world now. Half a room, really. Earl had the side with the better view. Not that there was much to see, just a glimpse of the fir trees beyond the parking lot. "Walter," I said, "and I can't make any promises about the snoring." Earl grunted, which I'd learned was his version of a laugh. "Fair enough. You play cribbage?" "Haven't in years." "You do now. Patricia says lunch is at noon. Food's garbage, but the coffee's decent if you like it strong enough to strip paint." Dorothy across the hall hoards the good cookies from the vending machine. Rose down the hall makes moonshine in a Listerine bottle. "Welcome to Maplewood, Walter. Try not to die right away. I just got used to my last roommate." I sat down on my bed, the springs creaking under my weight, and looked at this stranger who was now the person I'd see first thing every morning and last thing every night. Earl had gone back to his book, already dismissing me, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not quite breaking, but definitely fracturing. This was it. This was what my children had chosen for me. This beige room with this strange man and this view of a parking lot where nobody would ever come to visit. I thought about Margaret, about what she'd say if she could see me now. And then I thought, maybe this is exactly what I deserved for believing in something that stopped being true a long time ago. Earl turned a page in his book without looking up. By the way, poker games on Thursday nights in the common room. Bring quarters if you've got 'em. Dorothy cheats, but we pretend not to notice because she used to be a teacher and it makes her feel clever. Despite everything, despite the beige walls and the thin mattress and the fact that my children had thrown me away like an expired prescription, I felt the corner of my mouth twitch up. "I'll see if I can scrounge some up," I said. Earl grunted again. Good man. And just like that, without meaning to, without planning it, I'd taken the first step toward building something I didn't even know I needed yet. A new family, one that would actually show up. The first month at Maplewood felt like living underwater. Everything was muffled and slow and strange. I'd wake up disoriented, reaching for Margaret's side of the bed before remembering where I was, that I wasn't home, that there was no home anymore, that Earl was snoring across the room like a freight train with a vendetta. But Earl, it turned out, was impossible to stay miserable around. He had a story for everything. Every meal in the dining hall became an excuse to talk about Korea. Not the war parts, not the blood and the cold that I knew haunted him in the quiet moments, but the absurd parts. The time his unit stole a general's jeep for a joyride and nearly caused an international incident. The Korean family who'd hidden them in a barn and fed them kimchi that burned so bad Earl thought he'd been poisoned. The buddy who'd tried to adopt a stray dog and smuggle it home in his duffel bag. Dog made it 3 days before the CO found out, Earl said one afternoon, beating me at cribbage for the 5th time in a row. Court-martialed the poor bastard. Not really, but damn near. 15-2. I pegged my points, already knowing I'd lost. What happened to the dog? Korean kid adopted him. Last I heard, that mutt lived to be 17. Outlived half our platoon. Earl shuffled the cards with the practiced ease of someone who'd been playing cards in foxholes and hospital beds for 70 years. Your deal. And stop looking so damn gloomy. You're not dead yet. Just feels like it sometimes. Yeah, well, feeling sorry for yourself is boring. Trust me, I tried it for a decade after I got back. Didn't help. He dealt the cards with sharp, decisive movements. You meet Dorothy yet? I had. Dorothy Mackenzie lived in room 12A, directly across from us, and she was impossible to miss. 83 years old, rail thin, with silver hair she wore in a bun so tight it looked painful, and a voice that could cut glass when she wanted it to. She'd been a high school English teacher in Deer Park for 40 years, and she'd never quite retired from correcting people. It's Earl and I, Walter, not me and Earl, she'd said the first time we met, appearing in our doorway like a particularly stern ghost. Subject pronouns. I expected better from a pharmacist. I sold pills, Dorothy, not grammar books. Clearly. But her eyes had sparkled, and she'd brought us cookies she'd sweet-talked from the kitchen staff. Real cookies, not the cardboard discs they served at meals. Dorothy recited poetry at odd moments. Whitman, mostly, but also Dickinson and Frost, and once, memorably, all of The Raven during a particularly boring dinner. She corrected the nurse's grammar, the doctor's pronunciation, even the TV when the news anchors split their infinitives. She was irritating and brilliant and lonely in a way that made my chest ache. Her kids visit? I asked Earl, picking up my cards. Son came once, right after she moved in. Stayed 20 minutes, spent 15 of them on his phone. Hasn't been back since. That was 2 years ago. Earl studied his hand. Dorothy doesn't talk about it, but Rose says she heard her crying one night. Some anniversary or birthday, can't remember which. Rose Kowalski, no relation to my old neighbor Mr. Kowalski, I'd checked, lived 2 doors down in 14D. 79 years old, built like a fire hydrant, with a laugh that could rattle windows and hands that still bore the scars from 3 decades working at Kaiser Aluminum in Hilliard. She'd lost her husband Frank 5 years ago to a heart attack, and her daughter had moved her to Maplewood, just until we figure things out. They were still figuring. Rose made the best peanut brittle I'd ever tasted. She cooked it on a hot plate she wasn't supposed to have, hiding it under her bed whenever Patricia did room checks. She'd bring it to the common room wrapped in wax paper, and we'd sit around the TV eating it while watching Jeopardy, shouting answers at Alex Trebek like he could actually hear us. "What is the Treaty of Versailles?" Dorothy would shout, sitting ramrod straight in her chair. "Who is Hemingway?" Earl would yell, never quite getting the response format right. "What is shut up? I'm trying to think!" Rose would holler, and we'd all dissolve into laughter. I started joining them for meals. Then for Jeopardy. Then for the poker game Earl had mentioned. Thursday nights in the common room, 5 of us around a folding table with a coffee can full of quarters in the middle. Besides Earl, Dorothy, Rose, and me, there was Harold Chen, a retired Boeing engineer who'd worked on 747s and spoke so softly you had to lean in to hear him. He played poker with mathematical precision and won more often than anyone else, which earned him Earl's grudging respect. "You count cards, Harold?" Earl asked one night after Harold pulled an inside straight. "I calculate probabilities," Harold said mildly, raking in the pot. "There's a difference." "Cheating with math," Earl grumbled. "That's worse than regular cheating." "It's not cheating if everyone can do it," Dorothy said, organizing her chips by value. "It's called having a functional brain, Earl. You should try it sometime." "I got shot at in Korea. That's my excuse for being stupid. What's yours?" I laughed so hard I nearly knocked over my beer. The contraband kind Rose smuggled in, disguised in a Listerine bottle that fooled exactly nobody but that Patricia pretended not to notice. Somewhere in those weeks, something shifted. The underwater feeling faded. I stopped waking up, reaching for Margaret, and started waking up to Earl's snoring and thinking about whether Dorothy would bring cookies or whether Rose would have a new story about her aluminum plant days. The dining hall food was still terrible. Mystery meat on Tuesdays, something pretending to be lasagna on Fridays. But it tasted better when Earl was doing his Korean War commentary, and Dorothy was correcting the nutritional information posted on the bulletin board. "Excuse me, that sign says less calories," Dorothy announced one afternoon, stopping mid-stride to glare at the offending poster. "Fewer calories. Calories are countable. This is basic grammar." "Dorothy, nobody cares," Rose said, patting her arm. "I care. Language matters. Civilization crumbles when we stop caring about the difference between less and fewer." "Pretty sure civilization's got bigger problems," Earl said. "Yes, and they all started with poor grammar." Dorothy marched over to the poster, pulled a pen from her cardigan pocket and corrected it. Patricia saw her do it and just sighed. 3 months in, I realized I hadn't thought about calling my children in weeks. 4 months in, Robert finally called me. I was in the common room, watching Earl and Harold play chess. Or rather, watching Harold systematically dismantle Earl's defenses while Earl cursed like the Marine he used to be. My phone rang, that old rotary phone ringtone I'd never bothered changing, and I saw Robert's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. "Dad, hey." Robert's voice distant and tinny. Traffic noises again. Always traffic noises. "Just checking in. How's the facility?" The facility. Like I was a car in storage. "It's fine, Robert." Good, good. Listen. I've been meaning to talk to you about the house. We've got a buyer interested. Really good offer. Should close by end of month. The house? My house? Margaret's house? The house where we'd raised them, where we'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas and graduation, where Margaret had died in our bedroom with hospice nurses whispering in the hallway. "You're selling it." Not a question. "Well, yeah, Dad. You're not living there anymore. Doesn't make sense to keep paying the utilities and property taxes. The market's really hot right now. You'll get a good price." "You'll get." Like the money would somehow make up for erasing 50 years of my life. "Where's the money going?" I asked. A pause. "Well, we figured we'd put it toward your care. Maplewood's not cheap, and Maplewood's costing you nothing, Robert. I'm paying for it myself out of the pharmacy sale." I kept my voice level, even though something hot and sharp was rising in my chest. "So where's the house money really going?" Another pause, longer this time. "We thought we'd split it. Between the three of us. For the kids' college funds. You know how expensive—" I hung up. Earl looked up from the chessboard. "You okay?" "No." I stared at my phone, at Robert's name still on the screen. But I'm starting to figure some things out. That night, lying in the dark listening to Earl snore, I thought about Margaret. About how she'd given everything to those kids. How she'd clipped coupons and bought day-old bread and wore the same winter coat for 15 years so we could afford Robert's band fees and Jennifer's dance classes and Michael's hockey equipment. How she'd worked the pharmacy register on weekends, her feet swelling in her shoes, so we could send them to decent colleges. How she'd loved them so fiercely it had consumed her, right up until the cancer consumed her instead. And how none of them had even bothered to show up on my 80th birthday. I got up, careful not to wake Earl, and walked to the window. The parking lot was empty except for the night nurse's Honda Civic. Beyond it, the Douglas firs swayed in the wind, dark shapes against a darker sky. Margaret used to say that family was everything, that blood was thicker than water, that you stood by your own no matter what, that the sacrifices were worth it because love always was. But lying there in the hospice bed, her hand in mine, her breath rattling in her chest like coins in a jar, She'd said something different. "I'm sorry you'll be alone," she'd whispered. "I won't be," I'd promised. "The kids will..." "Walter." She'd squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. "Don't wait for people who won't come. Find the ones who will." I'd thought she was confused from the morphine, that she didn't know what she was saying. But maybe Margaret had seen something I couldn't yet. Maybe she'd known, even then, how this would end. I stood at that window for a long time, watching the trees move, and thought about Earl teaching me cribbage. About Dorothy correcting grammar with the fierce dedication of someone who still believed words mattered. About Rose smuggling whiskey and making peanut brittle, and laughing until she cried at Harold's terrible jokes. About Thursday night poker games and Jeopardy battles and the way we'd all gotten into an argument about whether Pluto should still be a planet. These people. These broken, forgotten, lonely people who'd been dumped here by families who didn't have time for them anymore. They showed up. They stayed. And somewhere in the dark of that room, with Earl snoring peacefully across from me, I made a decision that would change everything. 6 months into my stay at Maplewood, I had a stroke. Not a big one, thank God. A TIA, the doctors called it, transient ischemic attack. A warning shot. It happened during breakfast, my hand going numb around my coffee cup, words tangling in my mouth when I tried to tell Earl something was wrong. I remember the dining hall tilting sideways. Remember Patricia's face swimming into view. Remember the ambulance ride with its sirens and sharp turns and terrible fluorescent lights. I spent 3 days at Sacred Heart Medical Center. The doctors ran tests, adjusted medications, told me I'd been lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt old and fragile and scared in a way I hadn't been since Margaret's diagnosis. My children didn't visit. Robert sent a text. "Glad you're okay, Dad. Keep us posted." Jennifer sent flowers. Generic ones, the kind you order online without thinking. Michael didn't respond at all. But Earl came. He took a Lyft, his first time using the app, which he complained about for 20 minutes, and sat in the chair beside my hospital bed reading the spokesman review aloud. Not the depressing parts. Just the comics and the weird local news and the sports scores, his gravelly voice turning everything into a story. Dorothy came, bringing a book of Mary Oliver poems she read in her teacher voice, measured and clear. Rose came with peanut brittle wrapped in tinfoil and gossip from Maplewood. Harold came and didn't say much, just sat there doing a crossword puzzle, his quiet presence somehow louder than words. When I got back to Maplewood, weak and shaky and needing a walker for a few weeks, they were waiting in the common room with a welcome back banner Dorothy had made from construction paper she'd stolen from the activities closet. "Couldn't let you die yet," Earl said gruffly, helping me to my chair. "You still owe me $12 from poker." 11, I corrected. "See? Sharp as a tack. You're fine." But I wasn't fine. I was 80 years old with a warning in my blood vessels and children who couldn't be bothered to visit me in the hospital. I was living in a nursing home with a roommate who snored and walls the color of surrender. I should have been miserable. Instead, I was surrounded by people who'd rearranged their schedules, what little schedule they had, to take a lift to the hospital, who'd brought poems and peanut brittle and the comics section, who'd made a construction paper banner because they actually gave a damn whether I came back or not. That's when I knew what I had to do. I called my lawyer the next week. Tom Whitmore. I'd known him since he was 14, buying comic books at the pharmacy and telling me he wanted to be a lawyer someday. He'd made good on that dream, opened a practice downtown, still stopped by to visit me when I'd been at the house. He came to Maplewood on a Tuesday afternoon in March, carrying his leather briefcase and looking concerned. "Walter, I got your message. Is everything all right?" We sat in the common room, away from the others. Through the window, I could see Rose tending to the small garden the staff had let her plant by the back entrance. Tomatoes and herbs and flowers she probably shouldn't have been digging in at her age. "Tom, I want to change my will." He pulled out his legal pad, clicked his pen. "All right, what kind of changes are we talking about?" I took a breath. "Everything. The house, before Robert sells it, the money from the pharmacy sale, the investment accounts, the savings, even the car in storage. All of it." "Okay, and you want to redistribute it how?" "I want to divide it equally among every current resident of Maplewood Elder Care. Not the staff, the residents, the people living here." Tom's pen stopped moving. "Walter, I know what you're going to say. Do you?" "Because I'm going to say that's approximately 23 people, Walter. Your children made their choice." The words came out harder than I intended. They put me here and forgot about me. They didn't come to my birthday. They didn't visit me in the hospital. They're selling my house, my and Margaret's house, and splitting the money between them for their kids' college funds. College funds, Tom. Not my care, not visiting me. College funds for grandchildren who don't know I exist. Tom sat back studying me. This is because of the stroke. This is because of the 6 months before the stroke, and the birthday before that, and every phone call that didn't come, and every visit that didn't happen. I looked out at Rose in her garden, at Dorothy reading on the patio, at Earl and Harold playing chess by the window. These people showed up, Tom. When I was in the hospital, when I couldn't remember how to hold a fork, when I needed someone to just sit there and remind me I was still alive. They showed up. And your children? Sent a text and flowers they ordered online. I turned back to him. I spent 52 years working 70-hour weeks so those kids could have everything. Margaret wore the same coat for 15 years so Jennifer could take dance. We took out a second mortgage so Robert could go to Seattle University. We drove a car held together with duct tape and prayers so Michael could play hockey. We gave them everything, Tom. Everything. And now you're giving everything to people you've known less than a year. I'm giving everything to people who act like family. I leaned forward. You know what Earl did last Thursday? He walked into town, Tom, on his bad hip that needs replacing, to get me a maple bar from Donut Parade because I mentioned I missed them. 2 miles each way. Dorothy spent 3 hours teaching me to play chess because she said I needed to keep my mind sharp after the stroke. Rose brings me peanut brittle every Sunday because it was Margaret's favorite and she knows I miss her. Tom was quiet for a long moment. What would Margaret say? That stopped me. I sat back, feeling the weight of the question. What would Margaret say? She told me, right before she died, not to wait for people who won't come, to find the ones who will. My voice cracked a little. I think she'd say I finally listened. Tom wrote something on his pad, crossed it out, wrote something else. Finally, he looked up. It's your money, Walter. Your estate. You can do whatever you want with it. But I have to tell you, your children will fight this. They'll contest the will, claim undue influence, diminished capacity. Let them try. I'm of sound mind. I'm making this decision freely. And I want it documented, Tom. I want it airtight. Because when I'm gone, I want these people, these forgotten, abandoned people who became my family when my real family walked away. I want them to know they mattered. All right. Tom started writing. Real writing this time. We'll draft it this week. I'll need you to sign it with witnesses. Earl and Dorothy, maybe? Perfect. He packed up his briefcase, stood to leave, then hesitated. For what it's worth, Walter, I think Margaret would be proud of you. After he left, I sat in the common room for a long time, watching my family, because that's what they were now, whether related by blood or not, go about their day. Earl won his chess game. Dorothy corrected a nurse's pronunciation. Rose showed off her tomato plants. Harold did a crossword puzzle, pausing occasionally to ask if anyone knew a 6-letter word for belonging. Family, I said quietly. Harold looked up. That's 6 letters? Fits perfectly. Thanks, Walter. Yeah, I thought. It really does. 2 weeks later, I signed the will. Earl and Dorothy witnessed, both of them looking solemn and honored in a way that made my chest tight. Tom filed everything properly, gave me copies, told me it was done. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. Not Earl, not Dorothy, not Rose or Harold. It felt like a secret I needed to keep, like a gift that would only make sense after I was gone. But I felt lighter, like I'd finally put down something heavy I'd been carrying since Margaret died, since my 80th birthday, since the moment I'd realized my children had stopped being my children somewhere along the way, and I'd been too stubborn or too hopeful to notice. That night, Earl and I stayed up late talking, something we did more and more, both of us too old to sleep through the night anymore. You ever regret it? I asked him. Not having kids? Earl was quiet for a while. Used to. Came back from Korea pretty messed up. Didn't think I'd be a good father. Probably wouldn't have been, truth be told. You regret yours? I thought about that. Really thought about it. I regret what they became, I finally said. Not who they were. Robert used to help me at the pharmacy on Saturdays, organizing the shelves. Jennifer would dance around the living room, making up stories. Michael would sit on my lap and ask me to explain how medicine worked, like it was magic. I paused. I don't regret loving them. I regret them not loving me back. That's their loss, Walter, not yours. Doesn't feel that way. Yeah, well, feelings lie sometimes. Earl rolled over, his back to me. Go to sleep, old man. Dorothy's bringing scones tomorrow, and I want you alert enough to fight me for the good ones. I smiled in the dark. Good night, Earl. Night. And lying there, listening to him breathe, listening to the building settle around us, listening to the distant sound of Rose laughing at something on her TV, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone anymore. And that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. 7 months after I signed the will, my health started its slow, inevitable decline. Nothing dramatic, no second stroke, no heart attack, no sudden emergency. Just the gradual dimming that comes when a body decides it's had enough. My appetite faded. Walking became harder, even with the walker. Some mornings I woke up so tired I wondered if I'd actually slept or just existed in that gray space between consciousness and whatever came next. Earl noticed first. He always did. "You're not eating your oatmeal," he said one Tuesday morning, eyeing my barely touched breakfast. The dining hall was full of the usual sounds. The clatter of plastic trays, the murmur of conversation, the TV in the corner playing the morning news nobody watched. Not hungry. "You haven't been hungry in a week." Earl pushed his own tray aside and leaned forward, fixing me with those sharp blue eyes that had seen too much in Korea, and apparently could see through me too. "Talk to Patricia yet? And tell her what? That I'm 80 years old and tired? She knows, Earl. There's tired and then there's dying, Walter. Big difference." The word hung between us like smoke. Dying. I'd been thinking it for weeks, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way that hollowed out my chest. "Maybe," I said quietly. Earl's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. Finally, "You scared?" I thought about Margaret, about how she'd looked in those final days, her body failing, but her eyes still fierce, still present, still her. She'd been scared. I could see it in the way her hand gripped mine, in how she'd ask me to stay close even when I was sitting right beside her. "Yeah," I admitted. "I am." Earl nodded slowly. "That's honest. That's good. Being scared means you're paying attention." He stood up, grabbed both our trays. "Come on. Dorothy's reading Whitman on the patio. Says she's got the perfect poem for autumn, which means it's probably depressing as hell, but at least it's depressing in a fancy way." I let him help me up. Let him walk slow enough that I could keep pace with my walker. Let him pretend he didn't notice how much I was leaning on the aluminum frame. These small mercies, Earl had hundreds of them, dispensed without comment, without making me feel diminished. Dorothy was indeed on the patio, sitting in her usual chair with her book of Leaves of Grass, reading aloud to whoever would listen. Rose was there too, knitting something that might have been a scarf or possibly a very long dish rag. Harold sat in the corner doing a Sudoku, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Ah, Walter," Dorothy said without looking up. "You're just in time. Song of Myself, Section 6. The one about grass." She cleared her throat dramatically. "A child said, 'What is the grass?' Fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he." She continued, her voice steady and clear, and I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. Whitman writing about grass as the uncut hair of graves, about the smallest sprout showing, there is really no death, about life continuing in different forms. Dorothy had chosen well. It was depressing, but in that fancy way Earl had predicted, the kind of depressing that felt like truth instead of despair. When she finished, Rose looked up from her knitting. "That's morbid, Dorothy." "It's transcendent," Dorothy corrected. "There's a difference." "It's both," I said, opening my eyes. "Can be both." Dorothy studied me over her reading glasses. "Are you all right, Walter?" "Just tired." "Tired," Rose repeated, setting down her knitting. "You've been saying that a lot lately." "Because it's true a lot lately." I tried to smile, make light of it, but something in my face must have betrayed me because suddenly they were all looking at me. Earl, Dorothy, Rose, even Harold glancing up from his puzzle. "Walter," Dorothy said gently, "what's really going on?" So I told them. About the exhaustion that had settled into my bones like winter. About the way food had stopped tasting like anything. About waking up some mornings and wondering if this would be the day I didn't wake up at all. About being scared, which was the hardest part to admit, but somehow the easiest to say to these people who'd earned the right to hear my truth. When I finished, the silence lasted long enough for the autumn wind to push a handful of leaves across the patio. "Well," Rose finally said, "that's shit." "Rose!" Dorothy looked scandalized. "What?" "It is. Walter's dying and that's shit, and I'm not going to pretend it's not. Rose picked up her knitting again, her needles clicking faster, angrier. Life's shit sometimes. We all know it. We're all sitting here in this place because our kids couldn't be bothered, because we got old and inconvenient. And now Walter's dying, and yeah, that's exactly what it is. Shit. But, Harold said quietly, still looking at his Sudoku, we're here. Rose's needles stopped. What? We're here, Harold repeated, looking up now. Walter's dying, yes. That's shit, as Rose eloquently puts it. But he's not dying alone. We're here. Something broke open in my chest. Not painful, just sudden and vast. Harold was right. I was dying, probably sooner than later, but I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by people who'd chosen to be here, who'd chosen me, who'd become family in the truest sense of the word. Yeah, I said, my voice rough. You are. Earl stood up abruptly. I need a drink. Who's in? Earl, it's 10:30 in the morning, Dorothy said. I'm aware. That's why I said drink, not cocktail. There's whiskey in Rose's room. Let's go. We went. All of us. A slow procession of old people with walkers and canes, and Dorothy's perfect posture making the whole thing look almost dignified. We crowded into Rose's room. She had the single, a perk of seniority, and she produced the Listerine bottle from under her bed. I knew you were all criminals, Patricia said from the doorway, making us jump. She looked at the bottle, at us, and sighed the sigh of someone who'd seen everything twice. I didn't see anything, but if you're going to do this, at least use real glasses. The plastic cups from the dining hall make everything taste like chemicals. She left and came back with 5 actual glasses, proper ones, the kind you'd use for whiskey if you were drinking it somewhere other than a nursing home at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. Rose poured, her hands steady despite her age, and we each took a glass. To Walter, Earl said, raising his, for not dying yet. Earl! Dorothy looked appalled. What? It's true. To Walter, for hanging on long enough for us to have this drink with him. To Walter, Dorothy amended, for being brave enough to tell us the truth. To Walter, Rose said, for picking a good family, even if it took him 80 years. To Walter, Harold finished quietly, for showing us what family really means. We drank. The whiskey burned going down, harsh and real and alive. I'd never tasted anything better. The weeks that followed had a strange quality, like time had slowed down and sped up simultaneously. Days felt longer, but weeks passed in a blur. I spent more time in bed, less time at meals. The walk to the common room became a journey. Patricia started checking on me more frequently. Her professional kindness edged with something softer, more personal. My children called. Not often, but more than before. Like somehow they'd sensed the shift, the approaching end. Robert called on a Sunday, his voice tinny and distant. Dad, hey. Just checking in. How are you feeling? Tired, I said, because it was easier than the truth. Well, get some rest. I'll try to visit soon. Lisa's been asking about you. He wouldn't visit. We both knew it. But I said, that would be nice. Because what else was there to say? Jennifer sent cards. Get well cards with generic messages and her signature at the bottom. Nothing personal, nothing real. Michael didn't call at all until Patricia finally contacted him. Told him he should probably come if he wanted to see me one last time. He came on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was dozing in my chair by the window when he walked in, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his expensive suit and designer glasses. He'd always been the most ambitious, the most driven, the one who'd moved the farthest away in every sense. Hey, Dad. He sat in the chair Earl usually occupied, looking around the room like he'd never seen anything quite like it. How are you? Dying, I said bluntly, too tired to sugarcoat. He flinched. The nurse said you were declining, but you didn't believe it? I studied him, this stranger who had my eyes and Margaret's nose and none of the warmth either of us had tried to pass down. Or you didn't care enough to check yourself. Dad, that's not fair. You're right. What's fair? Was it fair when you didn't show up on my 80th birthday? When you sent me here and never visited? When your mother was dying and you couldn't be bothered to fly home until after the funeral? The words came out harsh, bitter, months of hurt compressed into sentences. Michael's face reddened. I had work, Dad. A career. Responsibilities. And I had a son. At least I thought I did. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted. Why did you come, Michael? Silence. When I opened my eyes again, he was staring at his hands. Patricia said you were dying, that I should come. So I came. Not because you wanted to, because someone told you that you should. I shook my head. That's the difference right there. That's everything. What do you want from me? His voice cracked, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be, the 6-year-old who'd sit on my lap and ask questions about everything, who'd believed his father could fix anything. I'm here now. Isn't that enough? No, I said gently, and watched something crumble in his expression. It's too late, Michael. You don't get to show up at the end and pretend the middle didn't matter. He left 20 minutes later. I never saw him again. Earl came back from dinner to find me crying. Quiet tears that I couldn't quite stop, for the son I'd lost long before I'd understood he was gone. Kid's an asshole, Earl said, sitting down without asking what happened. He didn't need to ask. He's my kid. Yeah, well, sometimes the worst assholes are the ones we raised. Earl pulled out his cribbage board. Want to play? Might take your mind off it. I don't think I can, Earl. I'm too tired. Then I'll play for both of us. You just sit there and watch me beat myself. Should be entertaining. He did exactly that, playing both hands, arguing with himself about strategies, deliberately making bad plays, and then cursing his own stupidity. It was absurd and wonderful, and exactly what I needed. By the end, I was laughing through tears, and Earl was grinning like he'd won something much bigger than a card game. You're a good man, Earl Patterson, I said. Nah, just a man who knows what it's like to be forgotten. He packed up the cribbage board. We take care of our own, Walter. That's what family does. Our own. That's what we were. Not bound by blood or obligation, but by choice. By showing up. By staying. I died on a Sunday morning in November, almost exactly 2 years after I'd arrived at Maplewood. The night before, I'd played one last hand of poker. Well, sat at the table while the others played, too weak to hold the cards but still calling out bets and bluffs. Dorothy had brought cookies. Rose had brought whiskey. Harold had won $17 and donated it all back to the pot so we could keep playing. Earl had walked me back to our room, helped me into bed, and sat in his chair reading his Louis L'Amour Western. Earl? I'd said into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you for everything. A long pause. Then, you too, Walter. Now shut up and go to sleep. You're not dying tonight. I'd know. But he was wrong. I went to sleep and didn't wake up, slipping away sometime in those quiet hours before dawn, when the building was still and the world held its breath between darkness and light. Earl found me, checked my pulse with fingers that shook slightly, sat there for a while, just sitting with me like he'd done so many times before. Then he walked slowly down the hall and told Patricia, who made the necessary calls, who set in motion all the machinery of death that modern life requires. My children arranged the funeral. I knew they would. It's what you do, what society expects, what makes you look like a good son or daughter to people who don't know any better. They rented the cheapest chapel at Hennessy Funeral Home, a place I'd never been and probably wouldn't have chosen. They ordered flowers, one arrangement, carnations, and baby's breath, the budget option. They wrote a eulogy that made me sound like a stranger. Loving father, dedicated pharmacist, pillar of the community. Words that meant nothing because they had no stories to back them up. Robert gave the eulogy, his voice steady and professional, like he was presenting at a board meeting. Jennifer cried, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I'd have bet money those eyes stayed dry. Michael stood in the back, checking his phone, his discomfort obvious to anyone who cared to look. The chapel was mostly empty. A few people from the pharmacy days who'd seen the obituary. A neighbor from Brown's Addition. Tom Whitmore, my lawyer, sitting in the back with his leather briefcase. And then, 15 minutes into the service, the back doors opened. They came in slowly, helping each other, Earl with his cane, Dorothy holding Rose's arm, Harold pushing Mrs. Chen's wheelchair. 23 residents of Maplewood Elder Care, dressed in their Sunday best, some wearing colors I'd never seen them wear, some with medals and pins and jewelry they'd saved for special occasions. They filled 3 pews, a constellation of old faces that meant more to me, wherever I was now, whatever came after, than anything my children had said or done. Robert faltered in his eulogy, staring at this unexpected audience. Jennifer stopped fake crying. Michael looked up from his phone. The service continued, awkward and off balance now. And when it ended, Robert approached Tom Whitmore. I wished I could have seen this part. Wished I could have watched their faces. Thank you for coming, Robert said, extending his hand. Were you a friend of my father's? I'm his lawyer, Tom said, not taking the hand. Tom Whitmore. And yes, we were friends. Known him since I was 14. His lawyer? Jennifer appeared at Robert's elbow. Do we need to schedule something? For the estate? Actually, Tom said, pulling a document from his briefcase, I was instructed to read the will immediately following the service. Your father was very specific about that. If you'll ask everyone to stay seated, please. Robert's expression shifted. Confusion, then calculation, then something that looked like anticipation. Jennifer glanced at Michael. They thought they knew what was coming. A year of estate planning, splitting assets, college funds secured. They had no idea. Tom walked to the front of the chapel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying. I'm going to read Walter Brennan's last will and testament, as per his express wishes. The room went silent. The Maplewood residents sat together, confused but attentive. My children stood near the front, waiting for validation, for vindication, for the inheritance they'd been counting on since the day they'd sent me away. Tom began to read. He read every word, every clause about the house, the investment accounts, the car in storage, the savings accounts, the small pension. He read the amounts, the dollar figures that represented 52 years of work, of saving, of building something to leave behind. And then he read the distribution, divided equally among all current residents of Maplewood Elder Care, with special provisions for those who might pass away before the estate settled, their shares distributed among the remaining residents. To my children, nothing. Not $1, not one possession. The silence that followed was absolute. Earl started to cry, silent tears running down his weathered face. Dorothy covered her mouth with both hands. Rose grabbed Harold's hand and squeezed. Around them, the other residents sat in stunned disbelief, some crying, some laughing, some looking at each other like they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. My children stood frozen. Robert's face had gone from confusion to shock to red, pulsing anger. Jennifer had gone pale. Michael just stared, his mouth open. This is a joke, Robert finally said. You can't, it's legal, Tom said calmly. I assure you, it's been reviewed by multiple attorneys. Your father was of sound mind when he signed it. He had full capacity. He made this decision freely and with full understanding of its implications. We'll contest it, Michael said, finding his voice. Undue influence, diminished capacity, something. You're welcome to try, Tom said. But I should warn you, your father anticipated that. He included a provision. Any child who contests the will forfeits their right to contest and must pay all legal fees for both sides. He was very thorough. Jennifer found her voice. How could he do this? We're his children. We're his family. Tom reached into his briefcase again and pulled out an envelope. He left you this. He handed it to Robert, who opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single page, handwritten in my careful pharmacist's script. Robert read it silently, his face cycling through emotions too fast to catalog. Then he read it aloud, his voice hollow. Family is who stays. Family is who shows up. Family is who sits beside your bed and reads you the news when you can't hold the paper yourself. You taught me what family isn't. They taught me what family is. Learn the difference before it's too late. I spent 80 years loving you. They spent 2 years loving me back. That's the difference. That's everything. I hope someday you understand. I hope someday you find people who show up for you the way these people showed up for me. I hope it doesn't take you until you're 80 to figure out what matters. Love, Dad. The silence after he finished was broken by Rose, who let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Walter, you magnificent bastard, she said to the air, to wherever I was, to the memory of me sitting in her room drinking contraband whiskey. Robert crumpled the letter in his fist. This is bullshit. This is justice, Dorothy said, standing up with all her teacher authority. You abandoned him. You sent him away and forgot about him. You didn't even visit when he had a stroke. You don't get to stand there now and claim you're the victims. You don't know anything about our relationship with our father, Jennifer said, but her voice wavered. I know he waited for you on his 80th birthday, Earl said, standing too, leaning heavy on his cane. I know he set the table for 4 and made a cake and waited until 9 at night before he accepted you weren't coming. I know he cried that night, alone in his room, wondering what he'd done wrong. I know because he told me, because I was there. Where the hell were you? Michael stepped forward. You manipulated him, all of you. You saw an old man with money and you— We saw a man, Harold said quietly, but his voice carried. Just a man who needed friends, who needed family. We didn't know he had money. We didn't care. We cared about him. Tom cleared his throat. I think we're done here. Mr. Brennan's estate will be settled according to his wishes. If you choose to contest, contact my office. Otherwise, I'll be in touch with the beneficiaries. He looked at the Maplewood residents. He wanted you to know that you mattered, that you made his last years worth living, that you were the family he chose when his family of origin chose to leave. He packed his briefcase and walked out, leaving my children standing in the chapel like statues of everything they'd lost and everything they'd never understood. The residents of Maplewood stood slowly, helping each other up, preparing to leave. As they passed my children, Dorothy paused. He loved you, she said quietly. Right until the end, he loved you. He just loved himself enough to choose people who loved him back. I hope you learn that lesson. I hope your children don't have to learn it from you the way Walter learned it from you. They filed out, a procession of the forgotten and abandoned and lonely, now suddenly less lonely, less forgotten, less abandoned. They'd inherited money, yes, but more than that, they'd inherited the knowledge that they'd mattered to someone, that their showing up, their staying, their choosing to be family had meant everything. After the funeral, they went to the house on Brown's Addition, the house that was now partly theirs. Earl made coffee in Margaret's percolator, the same one I'd used for 50 years. Rose brought out the chocolate cake she'd baked that morning, arranged it on Margaret's good plates, served it with Margaret's silver forks. They sat in the living room where I'd waited on my 80th birthday, where I'd watched candles melt into frosting, where I'd learned the hardest lesson of my life. Dorothy stood and raised her coffee cup. To Walter, she said, who taught us that it's never too late to choose your family. To Walter, they echoed and drank. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, I was sitting next to Margaret, holding her hand, telling her about Earl and Dorothy and Rose and Harold and all the others, telling her about finding family in the last place I'd expected, telling her about learning, finally, what she'd tried to tell me before she died. You were right, I said, about not waiting for people who won't come, about finding the ones who will. Margaret smiled, that smile I'd loved for 43 years, would love for eternity if eternity would let me. I'm proud of you, she said, for learning, for choosing, for understanding. It took me long enough, but you got there. That's what matters. You got there in the end. And she was right. I had. I'd learned that family isn't about blood or obligation or what you're supposed to feel. It's about showing up. It's about staying. It's about choosing each other, day after day, until choosing becomes loving, becomes family. I'd learned it late, but I'd learned it true. And that made all the difference. Back at Maplewood, Earl sat in our room, his room now, just his, and picked up my photo from the bedside table. Margaret and me at Lake Coeur d'Alene, 1985, laughing at something long forgotten. He set it on his own bedside table, between his Korean War medal and his dog-eared Louis L'Amour Western. Night, Walter, he said to the empty room, to the empty bed, to the memory of his friend who'd taught him that it was never too late to choose your family. See you in the morning? And in the morning, there would be pancakes in the dining hall, and Dorothy would correct someone's grammar, and Rose would bring peanut brittle, and Harold would win at poker. There would be Jeopardy at 7 and complaints about the meatloaf and that strange, beautiful, chosen family that had saved us all. The family that stayed. The family that mattered. The family that was, in the end, the only family that ever really counted. The end. On my 80th birthday. My children didn't show up and sent me a message. We don't want to waste time taking care of you, and sent me to a nursing home. 2 years later, I made my will, dividing all my inheritance with the elderly. There, leaving my